It's the shock report that reveals that white Brits may be a minority in the UK as soon as 2063.
We'll be talking to the author of that report, Professor Matt Godwin from Buckingham University, about what it means and why it matters.
Can we actually just step back and look at how this country is going to evolve over the next 75 years? This is going to be like nothing we have ever seen before. This is going to radically transform how our country looks and feels, not only in terms of race and ethnicity, but in terms of the lineage and the roots that people have in this country and the religious identity of this country.
Well, we have a new report before us which has predicted that the white British population could become a minority in the UK within the next 40 years, primarily due to sustained immigration and varying birth rates among different ethnic groups. The analysis, which looks at migration, birth rates and death rates all the way to the end of the century, suggests that the white Brits in this country, currently around 73% of its makeup, is set to fall to 57% by 2050 and could actually become a minority by 2063. The man who's done the research is Professor Matt Godwin, who's Senior Visiting Fellow at the University of Buckingham and indeed the author of the Matt Godwin Substack. So Matt, first of all, if I can call you that, rather than Prof, which
it's good to be here, by the way.
It's good to see you, be a bit formal. Tell us how you amassed this huge amount of research to come to these conclusions.
Yeah, sure. So every few years, somebody will look at the UK's population and try and do projections of how it's going to evolve. And what we'll do is we'll take the census data from 2021 and we'll do something called cohort analysis, where we will basically look forward based on information in that census and taking into account migration rates, how different groups are likely to evolve if things as they are stay broadly static, if birth rates stay as they are, if levels of migration stay as they are, and then we look forward. Now, there's always a caveat with population projections. You take them with a little bit pinch of salt. But the point I would make is over the last 30 years, every projection about the UK population has understated the scale and the pace of change. So I'm pretty confident with these numbers. But bear in mind that if, for example, we have another crisis like Ukraine, we have another big crisis like the war in Afghanistan, or we have another big surge of migration like we did with the so-called Boris wave, then obviously that will change the picture slightly. But the overall messages here, I think, will remain pretty consistent.
Can you give us a bit of detail on, you say that those models over the 30-year period have understated that. Can you give us any figures?
Well, I mean, if you look, for example, at how the ONS and others have tried to guess net migration levels in this country, it's basically been a constant exercise of revising those estimates upwards because they've never quite been sure as to who's coming in and who's going out. We know also there are lots of people in the country we just don't know how many are here illegally, about 1.2 million according to some estimates. We've got the ongoing small boat crisis, which is adding marginally to this picture. But basically the story here, white Brits becoming a minority by 2063, the foreign-born, people born outside of the UK and their immediate children becoming a majority by 2079.
Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm your host and presenter, Jindex Stories. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing super great from wherever you're watching me from. Now, there is something that is sparkling around the internet and it got a lot of people into debate. People are trying to talk about this because there is a study that says that in the next 40 years, white British people will go extinct or they'll become minority. And you know very well that this has implications and it got a lot of people talking. And remember when sometimes back, there's a video that I created trying to talk about how the black population will keep on increasing against all these shifts that people are trying to say that are happening. Look at the population in Africa. The population in Africa itself keeps on increasing despite all the challenges that are being put towards them. Now, demographic forecasting is a tool often used by political scientists and demographers to anticipate future shifts in nations' population structure based on current trends in immigration, fertility, mortality, and aging. Professor Matt Godwin, who is known for, his populist work, and he has done extensive research towards this. When Professor Matt Godwin projects that white British people may become a minority in the United Kingdom within 4 decades, he is not suggesting a dramatic replacement, but rather a gradual reconfiguration of nation's demographic. This projection is based on census data, birth rates, and patterns of immigration that suggest a steady diversification of British ethnic composition. The term minority here refers to the point at which white British people no longer make up over 50% of the total population. Although they will still remain the largest single ethnic group, this is an important distinction to make as it emphasizes demographic transition rather than replacement. And just watch this video. I'm your host and presenter, Genetic Stories. If you find values in this video, you can consider subscribing to my channel, join my membership so that we can continue discussing all these geopolitical shifts that are happening across the world. Right, so let's watch the video. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts at the end of it all. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, Eugene Talk Stories. But until then, let's roll it up and, study.
And 1 in 5 of all people in the UK by the end of this century following Islam, which is closer to 1 in 4 among the under 40s, those broad changes, I don't think will actually be, they won't change. Those are pretty consistent.
Okay. Should we sort of take some of those points in turn then? So the rise in foreign-born and second-generation populations, what are the figures for that?
So what you're going to see is, at the moment, we've got about 19% of the UK population is comprised of people who were born overseas. Mm-hmm. Between this year, 2025, and the end of the century, that's going to go to closer to 60%, just above 60%. So, in other words, 6 in every 10 people in the UK by the end of this century will either not have been born in the UK, or they will be the children of people who were not born in the UK. Mm. So the point behind that, the reason I think that's important, is if you believe, as many people do, that what you need to make a nation state viable is a sense of continuity, a sense of strong bonds to history, collective memory, identity, ways of life. Well, we're going to go from a country where the vast majority of people have that, as they do now, to a country where very few people will actually be able to trace their families back more than 1 or 2 generations, because the majority will be foreign-born or the immediate children of foreign-born. So, of course, some of them will be classified as British, but they won't actually have that long sense of continuity that has defined these islands for generations.
I mean, is this meant to be an alarmist report? I mean, how do you feel about it, both of you? As white men living in Britain with, I would imagine, quite a lot of English ancestry, particularly for you, coming from Newcastle. I mean, I'm a bit kind of European. I'm half Irish, half Italian, I don't think. But, you look at that figure. This is the needle we have to grasp here in this podcast. Yes, there is something worrying as a white British person about the idea of white British people becoming a minority in such a short space of time. Having said that, whether people are foreign-born or not, or indeed practicing of different religions, the question is, what is Britain and Britishness? And if people come here and share our values, then that is less problematic. I mean, is it just the way of the world? We're kind of open borders, people move around. You've mentioned already, Matt, conflict in the Middle East and other kind of world events displacing huge amounts of people. This isn't just a British problem, it's a European problem.
Well, I think the points I would make in reply, one would be, if you were to tell, for example, the Pakistanis that white Europeans were going to become a majority in their country in the near future, or the Japanese that Indonesians were going to become a majority, there would be a very vigorous national debate, and there would be a lot of concern about that. It's only white Europeans who are told that they should not be concerned about these changes and should not even debate them, or indeed, if they do, it is considered by some to be alarmist. What I have tried to do with this report is say, can we get ahead of this current debate about small boats and Keir Starmer and what's going on. Can we actually just step back and look at how this country is going to evolve over the next 75 years? This is going to be like nothing we have ever seen before. This is going to radically transform how our country looks and feels, not only in terms of race and ethnicity, but in terms of the lineage and the roots that people have in this country and the religious identity of this country. Now, that is going to raise a whole host of questions. Can you unify a nation state that is comprised mainly of people that have been born abroad and can't trace their roots back over generations? What does the fact that by the year 2100, in one of our scenarios, close to 1 in 3 young people will be Muslim, what does that mean for the debates we're currently having now about blasphemy laws, free speech, free expression, women's rights, when the national share of the population that is Muslim today is 7%? Well, how are those debates going to evolve when it's closer to 25%? These are very serious policy questions we have to ask. Now, I'm one of those people that just puts the kind of alarmism to one side, and maybe, I'm less anxious as some. I just want us to have this conversation about where is this country going, because clearly it is not going currently in a very healthy direction. I don't think you'd find many people in this country that think multiculturalism's working, immigration's working, we have a strong sense of who we are. So we need to get ahead of this and start thinking about, well, who are we in the year 2100, which is really it's one generation away. I mean, for example, my daughter, who is 3, she will see almost all of the changes I write about in this report. If a child was born today, and let's say they're white British, by the time they turn 25, they will already be a minority within their country. So this is the pace of change that we're going to see. This isn't just a little bit more migration. The UK at the end of this century will look like nothing it's looked like before. It's going to be very profound.
So, to answer your question, Camilla, I think from my point of view, I would take the white bit out of it a little bit. I think skin colour is not so much of an important question in this. We've all got friends who are black, who are British Asian. The idea that they are less British somehow is quite insulting. So I wouldn't want to go down that route. I think it is, as Matt says, it's all about culture. It's all about identity, and there's no reason to fear anything here if, and it's a massive if, people who come to this country embrace British values, and that's really where I think the debate lies. I do think, as Matt says, it's important that we have these conversations, because I think there are an awful lot of people in politics who will shy away from it. They just won't want to go there. They'll be worried about being accused of being racist if they even have a conversation about it. So for me, it's a conversation about how do we preserve Britishness and British values, rather than necessarily being about skin colour.
I mean, there is a worry to the religious aspect, as you say, Matt. I've written a lot of stories on sort of blasphemy laws by the back door. There are concerns, and we've aired them in this podcast studio, about this definition of Islamophobia, concerns about the treatment of women in predominantly Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities, where they're not encouraged to speak English if they've travelled here from overseas, not encouraged to be at work and involved and economically viable. That disturbs me as a modern woman in 2025. I'm generally, despite being raised a Catholic, quite suspicious of what I would see as the extreme end of the kind of religious wedge. I am disturbed by what might be preached in madrasas, in the same respect that I am quite disturbed at times at some of the teachings of the Catholic faith, not least again when they relate to women. The trouble is, and what your research has revealed here, is that it's partly the fault of indigenous Brits, if we can call it that, for A, not having enough children, and B, becoming increasingly secular if we are to have a concern about, for instance, Muslims becoming more of a majority than they have been in the past. We are not, this whole we are a Christian country. Are we a Christian country?
Yeah.
No?
I guess, by the end of this century, we have two scenarios. We have a scenario where, of all net migration into Britain, net migration from predominantly Muslim states represents about 18% of that migration, which is broadly where we are now. But we have a high migration scenario where, well, what if that goes up to 30%? What if, for example, you have another crisis like in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq? Under that scenario, by the end of the century, close to 1 in 3 under 40s will be following Islam in this country. That would be an enormous shift for this country. It'd be huge. We can't even really begin to think about what that looks like. Now, I think the answer to, well, what is Britishness? I think there are two answers to that. One is you can pull off managing this scale of change by having a thin civic sense of Britishness, that if people get a passport, they do a little ceremony where they say they'll respect the laws of the land, and they are, in terms of paperwork, British. That will be enough to hold these islands together. There is another view that that is not enough, that you don't only need the administrative aspects of Britishness, but you do need a large number of people to be able to trace their families back over generations, to have a sense of collective memory, a sense of the social glue that binds us together, that sometimes we find it hard to define, but it actually really matters, a sense of continuity, of longevity, and that is what is going to become very rare in this country by the end of this century.
It depends whether the social glue that holds us together is collective memory, or whether it's something. The surprising thing about the tensions that we've witnessed in recent years is, I mean, without being airy-fairy about it, there is a great deal that unites, actually, Jews and Muslims and Catholics. You know, it's a sense of family, it's a sense of patriarchy and matriarchy. Often it's a sense of, you know, putting a huge amount of emphasis on education. Often it's simply about gatherings around food. I mean, there is so much that actually does unite different communities. The problem is,
but couldn't you say that about any nation in the world?
You can say that about any nation of the world, but I think when people think that our immigration system has gone wrong here is because of the lack of integration between people that were born here and people that come here. And we witnessed this in Brexit, you know, and it was a different problem then, actually. I remember going up to Grantham, you know, how does Margaret Thatcher's old seat react to the idea of Brexit? The problem there was Polish immigrants coming in and working in silos and weren't integrating into that area. We're now talking about a wider level of immigration. But what I'm saying is,
a lot of the Poles have left, of course, and they've left, a lot of them, because they feel that this country has completely lost its way. That's why a lot of Poles have gone.
But this is about if we're talking about solutions, because this is painting a picture that people will come in and there won't be integration, and are you thinking that the society will fragment even further for the reasons you've listed? Guided properly, is there a chance that even if there is a changing face of Great Britain by 2100, that it won't be as antagonistic as it currently seems, with the backdrop of the war in the Middle East as an example of flaming tensions?
Isn't it a question of whether people want to come to Britain because they want to be British and embrace Britishness, or whether they want to come to Britain just because it's convenient to them, and then they don't want to become British at all. I would, to speak to Matt's point about for example, if you want citizenship, if you take a citizenship test, I'd be strongly in favour of, for example, people having to be able to speak English. I don't understand why anyone would come to any country and not speak the native language. I mean, apart from anything else, it makes your life pretty difficult if you can't speak the language. I think that would be a sort of fundamental, point number one for me. I think we're very tolerant in this country. There's no reason why anybody has to change, their religions or not celebrate their sort of heritage. But that has to come with that has to come below accepting, embracing, and liking British values, like free speech, like tolerance, like equality, for men and women, which a lot of people from other countries don't really respect.
And that is clearly not happening at the moment. We know we have around 1 million people in the country who cannot speak English. We've seen the research on that. We know that we have high levels of segregation. My biggest concern is that the people who run this country have a narrative about what this country is, which goes like this. We are Britain is a welcoming country that is defined by its embrace of diversity. This is what we might call the Keir Starmer, Sadiq Khan, Tony Blair line, that what defines us is that we welcome others. Well, if the only thing that defines a nation is that it welcomes diversity, it's also the same thing as saying that nation has no identity of its own, that it has no distinctive identity, history, culture, and sense of values or way of life of its own. And lots of British people and English people reject this, what I would call an elite narrative that says the only thing that actually defines us now is an acceptance of the other, because then you could be any country around the world. But there's lots of people who say there is something distinctive about Britain and England. I mean, to take these numbers and to perhaps push it a little bit further, I would say, well, you know, if you took a ship and you took all the parts of a ship off and you just put some other parts back on, is it still the same ship?
Well, I think the question I was going to ask you was, how do we make this happen, right? We've talked about the things that we would like to preserve, the things that people who come here should be embracing. How do you make that happen rather than just it being a vague hope?
Well, my view, and this is a way, if you read the paper, it's online at the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at Buckingham. This paper is very neutral, it's down the line, it's very factual. My personal view would be that we need to do two things. We need to dramatically lower the level of migration into this country, especially low-skill, low-wage, non-European migration that is making us poorer and is driving division in Britain. I think the evidence is quite clear on that. Even Keir Starmer has finally accepted many of the things we've been pointing to for the last few years. And you also, at the same time, need to invest in integrating our communities. Ever since David Cameron said multiculturalism has failed, we have had no successor to multiculturalism in this country. We used to, in 2001, with Ted Cantle and the Northern riots, we used to talk about community cohesion. Then it morphed into everybody saying multiculturalism is broken, and other folks said, well, we're sleepwalking to segregation, we're living in parallel lives. We have no serious government policy around integration, and there's a question as to whether you can even integrate a nation that is experiencing this level of churn and change. My answer would be bring net migration down below 100,000, get it roughly to where it was in 1997, and at the same time start to do what Denmark is doing, start to do what Austria is doing, by really ramping up integration efforts. You have to speak English. You cannot live in segregated neighborhoods, and if you do, the state has the power to shake up neighborhoods so they do not become segregated ghettos,
but how do you do that? How do you shake up neighborhoods?
Well, Denmark's done it. Denmark has now ruled that if social housing is more than 50% segregated, the state can come in, can basically close down that area of housing, and people are moved into more mixed neighborhoods. Singapore has done something very similar. There are other governments who are thinking way ahead of us, because in Britain we have this knee-jerk reaction, which is, ooh, that sounds a bit nasty, I'm not going to have that debate. Whereas other governments, the Austrians are now saying, you cannot bring family members in at all until you've shown that you're integrated into Austrian society. The Danes have said you can't bring relatives in unless they can show that they are fluent in Danish as a basic requirement. All these sorts of things that are happening elsewhere in Europe, we need to be looking at these and saying, how is it acceptable that we have 1 million people in this country who cannot speak English? I mean, how is it acceptable that the vast majority of social housing in places like Birmingham and Leicester and elsewhere has gone to people who are not actually born in the UK? This is not a serious social contract over the longer term. This is going to really create big political problems. And I would argue that what we're seeing with reform and so on, that is partly a proxy of this.
Well, let's talk about reform very briefly before we finish, because Nigel Farage is obviously now trying to be a proponent of very family-friendly tax policies. We'll have a debate on another day about the sense of trying to scrap the 2-child benefit cap. But clearly he is pushing in the direction of wanting to encourage people to have more children in this country.
Which is great.
We looked at you've looked at the statistics, and there are higher fertility rates among foreign-born individuals and indeed Muslims. So the UK-born fertility rate was 1.39. It's 1.97 for foreign-born people. For Muslims, it's 2.35, and for non-Muslims, it's 1.54. But I mean, without being incentivised to have children and being supported by the tax system and indeed childcare. I mean, you've mentioned a few countries in Scandinavia which have very high tax rates but very, very subsidised childcare. That needs to also be the policy direction of travel, surely.
Yeah, we need a serious pro-family policy in this country that is broadly similar to what you can see in other parts of the world. I mean, Israel, Hungary, Poland, some of it's working, some of it isn't. Tax incentives aren't enough. But in the way that we changed our culture around smoking, in the way that we changed our culture around environmentalism, we have to now seriously change our culture around family and supporting people to have children. And it's both, when people say on the sort of, further to the right, they say, well, aren't you just going to incentivize minorities to have more children or whatever? I never see that debate as being relevant, because it can both be true that some minority groups have a higher birth rate, and we need to do more to encourage Brits of all stripes, colours and whatever to have more kids. We have to get our birth rate above 2.1 in order to stand a chance of, ensuring the country basically can not only pay for its increasing number of old people, but can, not to be too existential about it, can survive over the next few centuries. And someone in government, no one in the big parties is willing to do it. And whatever you think about the welfare changes, the one thing Nigel Farage has done is shown a willingness to talk about, well, what would a pro-family policy look like? Here's my suggestion. Maybe some people have some other ideas. I think he should be applauded for just starting that conversation, because a lot of people in Britain, when you say we should have pro-family policies, they think, oh, you want to take us back to 1955 or whatever. But if you go to Israel, they don't talk like that. You go to Hungary, they don't talk like that. You go to South Korea, they certainly don't talk like that. They're thinking, how on earth are we actually going to keep this nation state going? And we have this slightly immature debate in the UK, where if you mention family, everybody kind of shuts down and says we can't talk about it. That has to change.
Fascinating. I suppose in countries like Korea, it's not so much immigration, is it? It's, as you say, their birth rate is, and Italy as well, their birth rate is so low that they are, as you mentioned, retired people. They can't keep their economy going if it goes on like this.
And nor will we. Yeah. By the end of this century, our birth rate will be 1.3. By the end of this century, unless we change.
And how would what would the proportion of retired people to working age people look like if that was the case?
Like nothing. Well, I don't know the exact figure, but like nothing we've ever had before. And the answer for many people is, well, that's why we need large-scale migration, right? And that's let's call it the liberal progressive argument. You need mass migration because we are going to have an aging society. But what that is doing, as Canada and others have shown, that's pushing us into this population trap, because guess what? Immigrants get old too. So then you're in this Ponzi scheme of forever needing more migration, while at the same time the capacity of the state to provide housing, to provide healthcare, to provide schools for a population that is growing. We're currently growing at about 10% our population growth, which is crazy.
Even though our birth rate is going down.
By historical standards, it's crazy. So the capacity of the state to then manage that population trap diminishes. So what then happens is everybody's living standards decline, because the infrastructure isn't there, the public services aren't there. So you're on a treadmill, and you've just got to keep going and going and going, because nobody has the courage to say, stop, we're going to get off the treadmill, we're going to stop this large-scale migration, and we're going to give people enormous incentives and very good reasons, 0% mortgages for people who have 2 or more children.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm hoping that you are doing super great from wherever you're watching me from. Now, the observation that Matt Godwin makes are really important, because it makes us question what are the factors that we are seeing these happening right now. Immigration plays a central role in this anticipated demographic shift. Remember, post-World War II, Britain faced labor shortages and opened up its door to immigrants from across the Commonwealth. That's Jamaica, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and others, to help rebuild the economy. This marked the beginning of modern multicultural Britain. In the decades that followed, new waves of immigration arrived from the European Union, especially after the 2004 EU enlargement, which allowed citizens of Eastern Europe countries such as Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria to migrate freely. right? Additionally, more recent humanitarian crises have led to increased numbers of refugees and asylum seekers from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Each wave of immigration has added to the ethnic diversity of the UK. And while many immigrants eventually diversify as British, their cultural and racial heritage contributes to the broader multicultural tapestry. So, generally, there's a shift, and there's a historical reason as to why we are seeing the white Brits as monolithic group that stands as a group without being mixed with other groups that came as a result of post-World War II demographic changes that they needed this population to keep the British force driving, right? Let's talk about the birth rate disparities, which further has compounded the demographic trend. On the average, immigrant communities tend to have higher fertility rates than the native-born white British population. For instance, South Asia and African families often have more children compared to the white British counterparts, whose fertility rates have been steadily declining over recent decades. This is not unique to Britain. It mirrors a broader trend observed across Western Europe, where declining native birth rates are accompanied by relatively higher birth rates among immigrant population. The reason for these nuanced cultural norms around family size, younger average age at childhood in immigrant communities, and structural factors such as community support system, all these plays a role. These fertility differentials, sustained over multiple generations and gradual shifts the demographic composition of the nation. Also, I'd like to address the aging of white British population is another crucial factor. As in many developing nations, the native population in the UK is aging rapidly. The median age of white British people is significantly higher than that of the immigrant groups. This means that a large portion of the white British population is nearing or has already entered retirement. While immigrants communities tend to be younger and more likely to be the workforce and reproductive age. As older generations pass away and the younger, more diverse generations replace them, the proportion of white British people naturally declines. This process is slow but continuous, and it is structural reality, not a result of political conspiracy or ideological agenda. It is a reality. This is something that is happening. Also, talk about census data and population projections published by the UK's Office for the Nation Statistics, that's the ONS, corroborate these long-term trends. In cities like London, Leicester, Birmingham, and Manchester, white British people have already become minorities, showing what may be the future for the rest of the country. London, for instance, became majority minority over a decade ago, where no single ethnic group forms a majority. What is happening in urban centers often foreshadows national change, as cities are typically the first to reflect broader demographic shifts. These changes are neither sudden nor catastrophic. They are the outcome of decade of evolving migration patterns, economic policies, and social integration process. Also, another dynamic at play is the intermarriage and identity formation within second and third generation immigrant families. Many children born to mixed-race couples or immigrant families identify with multiple heritages or choose British identity while retaining ethnic ties. The lines between categories such as the white British, black British, British Asian, or mixed race are increasingly blurred, reflecting the fluid nature of racial and cultural identity in a modern multicultural society. Therefore, even the statistical decline of white British Identity may not signify a total cultural rupture, but a transformation towards a more pluralistic, hybrid national identity that integrates multiple backgrounds. Also, this projected demographic transition, however, has become a focal point of political anxiety, especially among right-wing populists and conservative thinkers who frame it as a threat to British cultural continuity. Figures like Matt Godwin has highlighted these trends not just as neutral observation, but as a warning signs of cultural erosion, linking demographic change to social fragmentation, national insecurity, or loss of traditional values. These interpretations are deeply contested. Critics argue that such narrative stirs xenophobia and reinforce racial hierarchies by implying that whiteness is central to British identity, while in contrast, proponents of multiculturalism see this demographic transition as an opportunity to build a more inclusive, dynamic, and globally connected society. It is also important to recognize the role of globalization and economic restructuring in shaping these changes. British economy has shifted from manufacturing to services, finance, and tech sectors that attract global and labor and investment. The UK's global universities, healthcare system, especially the NHS, and the industry rely heavily on immigrant labor. In short, immigration is not just a demographic phenomenon, it is an economic necessity in a country with an aging population and labor shortages. This makes immigration-driven population growth a structural feature of modern Britain, not simply a political choice. Consequently, demographic diversification is tied to the very sustainability of the UK's economy and public services. Now, despite these facts, the idea that white British people becoming a minority is often weaponized by a far right-wing actors to stoke fear of white genocide or replacement. These terms, which originated from racist and white nationalist ideologies, are not rooted in demographic science but in conspiracy theory. They falsely suggest that immigration is part of a deliberate plan to erase white populations, thereby creating a sense of existential panic. This rhetoric is dangerous as it fuels hate crimes, political polarization, and resistance to necessary reforms. Responsible discussions about demographic trends must reject such extremist framing and instead focus on how to build a cohesive and equitable society for all citizens. Ultimately, I like to say that the projected minority status of white British people within the next 40 years should be understood as a culmination of historical, economical, and social political factors, not as a crisis, but as a natural demographic evolution, rather than fear or resist this change. Policymakers and communities must focus on fostering inclusion, dismantling structural racism, and building institutions that reflect and serves Britain's increasing diversity population. If the nation embraces this transition with honesty, openness, and fairness, it could lead to a more just and vibrant society. But if the demographic shifts is met with denial, fear-mongering, or exclusion, it risks undermining the very social fabric that democracy depends on. I'm your host and presenter, Eugene Stories. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.